Hello there and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde. Twice a week, I have the opportunity to sit down and discuss some of the events and issues that are going on in Idaho. And we've got a big one that we have to decide on in Tuesday's election. Now, if you've already previously voted, this may seem like old hat, but the question before Idaho voters, among a number of other things, is a yes or a no vote on HJR 5. Now, this is a constitutional amendment. And what it would require is citizenship for an elector to participate in an election in the state of Idaho. So these are the qualifications. This is the text of the actual question on the ballot. And yes, you may have to read it a couple of times to work through some of the legalese, but the qualifications of electors, basically every male or female citizen of the United States, 18 years old, who has resided in this state and in the county where he or she offers to vote for the period provided by law. Usually that's at least 30 days prior, if not, or if registered as provided by law, and they have to be, that's what can make them a qualified elector. This is the important part, though, and this is the part that we're being asked to vote on. No person who is not a citizen of the United States shall be a qualified elector in any election held within the state of Idaho. Now, if you're like most people, the first question that's going to come to mind is you're going to ask yourself, okay, why is it that we would need this in the first place? I mean, isn't it already illegal for people to vote if they're not already, a citizen of the United States? And of course, the answer is no, it's not legal. But does that mean that it doesn't happen? Let me share some information with you. And again, you have to make up your own mind as to whether to vote yes or no. I just want to point out that there are some very solid reasons why, despite the assurances that, well, it's not happening, or if it is happening, it's happening in small numbers. Perhaps you've noticed that that's kind of a trend in how people who are defending non-citizens voting in our elections, and primarily it's the Democrats who seem to do that, they seem to follow that pattern. Maybe you remember an exchange that took place here not too long ago between Martha Raddatz on, CNN, talking with vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance. And the question was over, well, are there Venezuelan gangs that are taking over apartment complexes in Colorado for criminal purposes? And the fascinating thing here was Martha started arguing with J.D. Vance about, well, but it was just a handful of these gangs taking over apartment complexes. And fortunately, he called her on this and said, do you hear yourself? Can you hear what you're saying? First of all, we argue it's not happening. There's no way that it's happening. And then it's happening, but it's just a handful. And the point is, it shouldn't be happening at all. And this is one of the reasons why HJR 5 is an issue for Idaho voters at this time. So let's talk a little bit about, is it true that non-citizens vote in U.S. elections? Well, the Washington Times in an article back in May says yes, it is true. And they give some pretty specific examples. North Carolina, I believe in particular, was dealing with a problem here. Neither side can say with certainty whether it's common or rare, but a series of criminal cases in North Carolina shows the problem is undeniable. Federal prosecutors in the state brought charges against 37 non-citizens who voted in the 2016 election. Now, there's one individual that they were talking about. They introduced him at the beginning of the article. He voted in many more elections than just one federal election. Some were one-time voters who showed up, registered, and cast ballots on the same day. But there were some trends that they found when they were researching these criminal cases that were brought in North Carolina. And these are some of the trends. The non-citizen voters were of various races and ethnicities. 7 were listed as Asian, 8 as Black, 10 as Hispanic, and 2 as white. 1 was multiracial, 5 listed as others, 3 showed no data. 1 was incongruously listed as American Indian or Alaska Native. Now, the 37 migrants, again, facing criminal charges for voting when they were not supposed to, cast a total of 99 ballots in records dating back to the 1996 elections. Most only voted in federal election years, though 1 regularly voted in municipal elections too. Some of the migrants remained on the voting rolls even after they were convicted and sentenced for their crimes. Still want to maintain that it's not a problem, or if it is, it's rare and nobody's turning a blind eye? Because that sounds otherwise. The registered Democrats outnumbered the Republicans by a 3-to-1 ratio. Is that surprising, by the way? because it really does seem the Democrats are the ones who push for this. Now, non-citizens are not voting in federal or state elections, the Brennan Center for Justice proclaimed back in April. The Law and Public Policy Institute pointed to its survey of 42 jurisdictions from the 2016 elections and found that officials referred just 30 cases of suspected non-citizen voting for investigation. Sean Morales Doyle, Brennan's director of voting rights, said non-citizens have no incentives to vote. He said a criminal record resulting from illegal voting could disqualify them from citizenship. Okay, fair enough. And at the same time, none of those deterrents seemed to stop Juan Francisco Landeros Morelos. He joined a line of people at a food pantry one day and ended up registering to vote. Now, to be fair, oftentimes when they are receiving government services or charity, people will graciously offer to sign them up to vote. And I don't suppose that's abated. And especially with the millions of people who have been allowed into the country illegally and in some cases quasi-legally under the president's parole authority, you know, as in the people brought in from Cuba and Haiti and Venezuela, etc. Yeah, there's a lot of people that have been brought in. And strangely, you know, when they sign up to get a driver's license or something like that, they're always asked, well, would you like to vote? So James Todd Jr. was the attorney for Mr. Landeros Morales. And he said that Mr. Morales came from Mexico decades ago. He's illiterate in English, so someone else filled out the form and then had him sign it. Mr. Todd said that he had handled a half dozen non-citizen voting cases, and the story was usually pretty much the same. Someone asks, would you like to sign up and be registered to vote? And not knowing better, the person goes along with it. Now, I want to pause here for just a moment and just point out, it's not a matter of necessarily even the citizen who is registered to vote is the one who ends up casting the ballot. When a person is registered to vote, the ballot is generated in their name. And as we saw in the 2020 election, and I know we like to, it's all settled. There was nothing hinky about that election. That's not true, though. And frankly, there were a lot of ballots that were harvested that seemed to appear seemingly by magic, especially after about 1 o'clock in the morning. So as long as there exists a person for whom that registration exists, whether they cast the vote or not, well, that's still a matter that never really was proven. And so questions remain. Would people stoop to that? Well, I don't know. How bad do people want to hang on to power? Would they, for instance, tell lies about, political candidates? Would they try to impeach political candidates and start FBI investigations? Would they weaponize whole branches of government? Would the entire media turn its wrath on an individual in an attempt to try to keep them from gaining office, only to gain their conscience back when it came time to vote? Because that's sacred, and we don't mess with stuff like that. Yeah, tell me another fairy tale, won't you please? All right. Back to the presentation here. So states were going through their voter rolls and they were actually purging non-eligible citizens from their voter rolls, not just non-citizens, but also people who were deceased. And that's why earlier this year, the Justice Department sued Virginia for violating the federal law's prohibition on systematic efforts to remove voters within 90 days of an election. Now, again, this is being portrayed as, well, we're just trying to protect the integrity here. We don't want people who could actually vote to be off of here. But at the same time, they're protecting people who really aren't supposed to be voting. And so whose side can you come down on? Virginia asked the Supreme Court to stay a lower court decision to halt that effort. The lower court had ruled in favor of the Biden administration, holding that Virginia's expedited attempt to remove non-citizens violated the National Voter Registration Act's prohibition on systematic voter roll removals 90 days before an election. So if they did it more than 90 days out, well, we wouldn't have a problem, but too close to the election and suddenly we do. Well, 26 states, including New Hampshire, Florida, and Ohio, and by the way, Idaho, led by our Attorney General Raul Labrador, joined an amicus brief supporting Virginia's effort to purge non-citizens from its voter rolls. And it was actually, I believe, just within the last few days, we got an answer from the Supreme Court. These states were arguing, among other things, that the lower court's injunction leaves Virginia, and effectively other states as well, with effectively no way to enforce its laws on voter qualifications. They also argued that the lower court misinterpreted the National Voter Registration Act and said Congress has no authority to require a state to allow a non-citizen to vote in federal elections. Thankfully, and I think it's the Babylon Bee who breaks the news to us, SCOTUS rules Virginia can have laws. In a devastating blow to Democrats, Supreme Court rules in favor of following the law. So there was that emergency stay was granted, so Virginia can continue to remove these non-citizen voters. I only share this with you to illustrate the point that, yes, it does happen. Now, we're a high trust society in some ways, and Senator Brian Lenny actually just pointed this out the other day. He says, look, I voted in Idaho without an ID. All I had to do was sign this piece of paper saying, I swear I am who I said I am, and then he says, I hope to get rid of the affidavit process, because that's really what it is. He just signed an affidavit, but there was no proof required, no photo ID, no other verification that he was who he said he is. And he says, I have the bill ready to go next year. This is a picture, actually, of the affidavit that he signed. So in a high trust society, you can get away with this. I don't know that we're living in such a high trust society at this point. And again, the choice is up to you as to whether or not to vote to amend the Idaho Constitution. Do we support HJR 5 and amending the Constitution to make sure that it says only U.S. citizens can participate in elections that are held here in Idaho? Well, on the one hand, you have people telling us it's not happening. On the other hand, well, it is happening. There's clearly proof that it is. At what scale? Well, okay, I'll concede. Nobody knows for sure. But given the millions of people who have crossed into this country illegally under the Biden administration's open border policies, given the efforts to register them to vote at every turn, does it seem more or less likely that people would abuse that ability to vote and to be registered to vote, whether they're citizens or not? I know how I would answer that question, and I'll throw one more bit of fuel on the fire here. Again, Democrats really seem okay with this. Wow, what's the harm? What could it possibly harm? Because they're looking at, this is a great way to get votes without actually having to win over voters. The whole idea, who's your daddy? Who's giving you the benefits? So it's the Democrats. And so I'll just point this out there. Idaho Senate Minority Leader Melissa Wintrow has come out on the record very much against HJR 5. She's against it. You may take that as you wish, but it should tell you a lot about whether or not it would be beneficial for those who are serious about election integrity. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Press club or bias all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.